Welcome everybody to this spotlight session on a human rights-based approach to disaster displacement. And when I say welcome, it's to everybody here in the room, but also to those who are joining us online. My name is Dr. Matthew Scott. I'm a leader of the Human Rights and Environment thematic area at the Royal Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, based in Lund, Sweden, but operating in collaboration with our regional Asia-Pacific office based in Jakarta, where we focus on human rights and environment, with a particular focus on climate and disaster-related displacement. So it's a great pleasure to be moderating the session today. I'd like to start off with the acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal, Jagera, and Yugara peoples of the land on which the conference will be held, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We also acknowledge the Turrbal, Jagera, and Yugara peoples' continuing culture and contribution to the life of the Brisbane region. In the spirit of reconciliation, we extend our acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and recognize their continuing connection to land, sea, waters, and community. We pay our respect to all elders, past and present. Now, why are we here? We're in a spotlight session on a human rights-based approach to disaster displacement. And we'll be hearing from our panelists very shortly, but I wanted to just set the scene by highlighting three main points, which will help you to set your thinking as we hear from the panelists. And the first point is that disaster displacement is widespread throughout the region. Many of you who work in the field will already know this, but you'll be thinking about it in terms of evacuation or planned relocation, or the situation of people who are in protracted displacement in informal urban settlements or elsewhere. A second key point, of course, by the name of the session, is that disaster displacement is a human rights issue. And that's going to be clear when we hear from the panel, but it relates to the impacts of being displaced in terms of rights to food, water, shelter, access to education, healthcare, and so on. So we'll be talking about that dimension of this widespread phenomenon. And the third point is that there's a clear policy imperative to systematically integrate considerations of displacement into national and subnational disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and sustainable development, law, policy, and practice. And perhaps you'll go away convinced of that when you hear from some of our panels. A final note is that this initiative to talk about human rights and disaster displacement has a strong impetus from the Sendai framework itself, as well as the Paris Agreement, which recognizes human rights as core principles within this context. So welcome to the Spotlight session. Now I'm going to introduce the panelists and hand over to them. So on my left, we have Dr. Christelle Casaba, who is the program manager, the international programs manager for the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We have next to Dr. Casaba, I know them all quite well, but I want to make sure that I cover their titles accurately. But Ms. Cecilia Jimenez Damari is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons. To the right of Cecilia Jimenez Damari is Professor Tasneem Siddiqui, who is the founding chair of the Department of Political Science and founding chair of RAMRU of the University of Dhaka. She led the framing of the National Strategy on Internal Displacement, which she'll be talking about today, as well as its action plan designed to implement that strategy. And finally, here to my immediate left is Eslene Garibiti, who is the Director General of Vanuatu's Ministry of Climate Change, Meteorology and Geohazards, Environment, Energy and Disaster Management, and as of last night, the winner of the WIN-DRR Excellence Award. So we have really a phenomenal panel here, and I'm going to hand over to Christelle, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So I will be starting this session, which will focus on people's experiences in disaster displacement with a few figures. Please bear with me. I will try to keep this short, but it will give you a sense, if you don't know it already, of the scale of the phenomenon across the whole region of Asia and the Pacific. Just earlier this week, on Monday actually, we released a new report, which we produced at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, jointly with the Asian Development Bank. This report is the result of 2 years of work, and it is to date the most comprehensive analysis on the drivers, the scale, the impacts, and some of the solutions to disaster displacement in the region. In this report, we go back a little over a decade, and we present data that accounts for all the disaster displacement we have been able to record from January 2010 to December 2021. So please bear this in mind. All the figures I will be presenting cover this time period. Over this time period, we accounted for over 225 million displacements linked with disasters across the entire region. That represents almost 80% of the global total. So Asia and the Pacific is by far the region that is most affected by disaster displacement. As you can see on this slide, there is no clear increase in the number of disaster displacement we record year after year. So I do want to bring this to your attention because we often hear about increasing numbers linked with climate change. The data doesn't show this. It is not to say that this is not true. It's only to say that a lot of the displacement that is linked, for instance, with the slow onset effects of climate change goes unrecorded. So please also keep this in mind when you see our figures. They are vastly underestimated. This image should give you a sense of how widespread the phenomenon is. We really have every country around the world, but especially in the region, affected by disaster displacement. I can cite the countries that are most heavily affected, and mainly the reason is also because they are the countries with the highest population size. But we have, for instance, the People's Republic of China, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan, Myanmar, and Nepal. We also have a very high disaster displacement record in the Pacific relative to the size of the island's population. A lot of these displacements occur in the context of preemptive evacuations. They are life-saving, they can be government-led, they do not necessarily link to protracted displacement. But some of these displacements are protracted. They can go on for weeks, for months, for years, and sometimes even for decades. Some people who are displaced, for instance, in the context of sea level rise, may never be able to return to their homes. This is a breakdown of our figures, just to show you that the vast majority of our figures and of disaster displacements in the region are occurring in the context of weather-related hazards, such as floods, monsoon rains, storms, and cyclones in the region. We also have about 12 million of our records that are linked with geophysical hazards, such as earthquakes, volcanic activity, or tsunamis. They are particularly prevalent in the Pacific in terms of percentage. This figure here gives you a sense of the distribution of our records across the entire region of Asia and the Pacific. As you can see, East Asia accounts for a little over 1/3 of our total records. Then Southeast Asia and South Asia represent around 30% of our figures. Central and West Asia and the Pacific represent a much lower proportion of our total. That is linked with several factors, not necessarily the fact that they are less disaster prone, but the fact that there are some countries with a lower density of population, or also the fact that we are less able to access data in some of the countries included in these regions. And now on to the focus of this presentation today. I will pause with this slide to say that all of the figures I just presented represent people, of course. And particularly in situations of protracted displacement that, again, can go on for months or even years. Displacement has a severe impact on people's lives, particularly when they're unable to access any type of support or durable solutions. At the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, we have developed a conceptual framework that looks at these impacts in the way that this graph illustrates here. We mostly document impacts on people's livelihoods, housing conditions, access to services and infrastructure, mental and physical health, access to quality education, security, social and cultural life, and in terms of the environment they live in. Now, we talk about affected people, not just displaced people, because in some cases, host communities or even communities of origin can also feel some of these impacts. It's important to note, and I will end on that these impacts are not distributed equally amongst different groups of people. Displacement tends to exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities. So we see that groups of people who are already maybe marginalized in some context or with lower levels of socioeconomic development will be experiencing these impacts even more severely. We can take the example in many contexts of women and girls, or IDPs with disabilities, or particular ethno-linguistic groups. I'll just end with a real-life example from a case study we recently conducted in Vanuatu. Out of the people who were displaced linked with the Ambae volcanic eruption, 1 in 3 women became unemployed as a result of their displacement. That compares with only, if I may say, 1 in 5 men. And in that same context, 77% of the children who were displaced experienced a break in their education. Now, of course, after some time, most of these people managed to find another job and the children went back to school. But nonetheless, this disruption in their professional life or in their education can have longer-term repercussions, also in terms of their access and their enjoyment of human rights. With this, I will end my presentation and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that detailed overview, Christelle. And key takeaways being, of course, the 225 million people displaced since 2010, or 225 million displacements, because the same people can be displaced multiple times. 78% of the global total reflected in this region, which is quite noteworthy. And that's a vast underestimate. So as Christelle was finishing off, she was opening the floor to Cecilia Jimenez de Mari, who will connect those impacts to human rights principles. So what is a human rights-based approach to disaster displacement? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. Good afternoon to everybody. Sometimes I don't know what time zone I'm in. But here we are, and we're talking about the human rights in disaster displacement, of which I very much feel strongly, precisely because that's part of the passion and commitment of the mandate of being a special rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. But before we begin, being a lawyer, I would like to remind everybody what is the definition of disaster displacement. And let me just quote you that they are situations where people are forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence. So there's an element of force there as a result of a disaster or in order to avoid the impact of an immediate and foreseeable natural hazard. What's very striking with the definition, accepted definition of a disaster displacement, is the fact that it very much closely follows the definition of who is an internally displaced person that is provided by the guiding principles on internal displacement. This guiding principles is a composite international legal framework that combines the human rights of internally displaced persons wherever they may be. Of course, when it comes to disaster displacement, we very much know that this is applicable to any of the drivers. And this could be any type, 4 types of disasters, but also including those that are connected to the effects of climate change. And when it comes to climate change, I would like to insist that it is not merely those climate change effects that are sudden onset, the more dramatic typhoons, cyclones, sudden rush tsunamis, etc., but also slow onset effects of climate change. Now, we have certain premises here when we come to the human rights of being applied in disaster displacement. And the first one I would like to make is that there is a necessity of human rights integration into DRR when it comes to disaster displacement. And why is this? Because disaster displacement is all about people being displaced. Each person has a human right, he or she, or wherever that person may come from or may be going. It's about people. Human rights are integral to people. They are universal. They are indivisible. And who is in charge? It is the state. The state has the primary responsibility to guarantee the human rights of all the people found in its territory, and particularly when it comes to people who have been displaced because of disaster, to actually have the affirmative action to protect them. This is international law, and it's actually part and parcel of the sovereignty of a state. Not to do so will mean that the state is forgoing its duty as a state to the people in its territory. Now, who is a state? Of course, a state is this political science concept that we all know. However, I would like really to insist that the implementation of human rights as a primary responsibility of the state would be the government in all its levels. It's not just the national or the federal levels, but particularly the local authorities, where disaster displacement is felt more acutely. And the lower you go, if you wish to put it that way, the lower you go in that scale of intervention, state intervention, the more granular the effects of the disaster displacement on the people. And when we come to what's being applied, human rights standards, I already mentioned the guiding principles on internal displacement, and there are other international human rights agreements internationally. But let us also think about the constitution of each and every state that is supposed to be implemented. And the constitution, I'm sure that in all the constitutions from your different countries, our countries, you would find there the responsibility of the state to protect its citizens. And human rights is all about intersectionality. When we talk about internally displaced persons, and already Christelle has mentioned that very clearly, there are different groups. Intersectionality of human rights would not only mean because they are displaced, but because of who they are. A child will feel disaster displacement impacts very differently from that of an adult. This is why we've got the Convention on the Rights of the Child, child rights, the right of children, particularly to education, the right to be heard, the right to be protected by the family, the community, etc., because of a child's vulnerability. Then, of course, we also have women and the right to equality per se, but I would also like to insist that climate change has particular impacts on the mobility patterns of these different groups. When we want to be really impact-specific on the affected groups, I would like to take one particular group that's really important, that we have to have a differentiated approach when it comes to human rights, and that would be the group of indigenous peoples, or the people who have attachment to their land. In fact, the guiding principles on internal displacement is very clear, that those groups of people who have particular attachment to the land, that's the code, have to be protected because of them being pastoralists, indigenous peoples, etc. And I've been all over the world, in many parts of the world. I have been able to speak about to indigenous peoples who have lost their lands because of displacement, either disaster displacement or otherwise. And what is really, really very painful is that they have lost, for them, they have lost their culture, and therefore they have lost their lives. We also speak about others affected groups, persons with disabilities, for example. And persons with disabilities are very particularly vulnerable when it comes to disaster displacement because of their limited mobility. And I can go on to tell you about all these different affected groups, but also let me, on the last bullet, is that there are particular risks to specific territories. We have people, for example, who live along the coast, and also people who may be more affected because they live on the mountains. And naturally, if we also speak about climate change, those rights of people who are living in small island states where the waters are rising are particularly experience acute risk. In fact, in 2020, I issued a report to the General Assembly that really looked at specifically on the effects on the human rights of internally displaced persons because of disaster displacement linked to slow onset effects of climate change. And I'd like to dwell on this very particularly, because even though it's not dramatic disaster displacement, over time they can actually be considered internally displaced persons, particularly if they have no choice but to leave the land eventually, or they cannot go back. So there is no element of choice, and therefore there is that risk that it is a forced displacement. The last point on this slide is participation, and it is a human right of each of us to be able to participate in decisions that affect us. This is not to be underestimated when it comes to internally displaced persons. Of course, we know that humanitarian groups are around, the state is there, and it's, and it is there is a necessity of ensuring that we have strategic visions and objectives to implement how these people can be protected. But in the end of the day, these people, internally displaced persons, are not passive objects, not only because they're different from each other, but also because each of the IDPs have political agency. I have been very adamant about the right to participation of IDPs, whatever the driver is for their displacement, to participate in decisions affecting them. Political agency, there is a right to exercise political agency. And in fact, again, let me go back to indigenous peoples. It has been said over and over again in many of the sessions in this forum that they not only have political agency, but they also have traditional knowledge with which on how to conserve and protect their lands and natural resources. So this is very much an importance of participation.
Cecilia, it's my duty to remind you of the time.
1 minute. And so, I'm not going to really go through this, but thank you, Matt. But applying human rights as protection in disaster displacement, I would like to just confirm that it is in all phases: prevention, response, solutions. We have international law for this, but we also have many examples that are really important to look at. And lastly, the institutionalization of those human rights in IDP law and policy, in the guidelines and strategies. We will hear from my fellow panelists, and most importantly, the institutionalization of human rights in governance. And this has to include, last but not the least, protective and due diligence standards under the treaties, including the Paris Agreement. So I stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview of human rights perspectives on disaster-related displacement, emphasizing the critical role of the state as the duty bearer in exercise of its sovereignty and constitutional duties, multiple aspects that relate to intersectionality, non-discrimination, active and meaningful participation of different groups, substantive rights. All of this we will find reflected in the coming presentations, first from Professor Tasneem Siddiqui. The floor is yours, discussing the approach that Bangladesh has taken to the phenomenon.
Thank you, everyone. What we have listened so far, I'll take you through a country experience which actually tried to have a human rights-based approach in developing national strategy and action plan to deal with displacement. We all know, we have heard all the data. Only through slow onset process, we have seen that 216 million people will be displaced if right kind of steps are not taken by 2050. And 19 million will be displaced in Bangladesh alone. We also have knowledge that displacement can be reduced. Sendai Framework, Cancun Adaptation Framework, Groundswell Report 2021 reiterates that up to 80% of the displacement can be reduced. This is something, it's a big challenge, but this challenge can be turned into an opportunity. Bangladesh, by 2015, started a process to come up with a national strategy how to manage displacement. And in 2021, the strategy was adopted by the government. Sorry. Now, this document is expressive human rights-based approach. It took an expressive human rights-based approach, and it is very much said that internally displaced persons shall enjoy in full equality the same rights and freedom under international and domestic laws as do other persons of the country. So, the laws, systematic integration of international human rights laws, UN guiding principles, on international displacement, the Sendai Framework, Nansen Principle, the SDG goal, all are incorporated along with national plans, 8th five-year plan, Delta plan, all others are included and, in this document. And all three stages, if you look into prevention of displacement, protection during displacement, and durable solution, all three types, like local reintegration, then return to place of origin, and resettlement. All sections are presented, and while the strategy, everywhere, all the international and national human rights laws are mentioned at the beginning, then the activities targets are mentioned. what are the main highlights? It is inclusive to all sections of the society: ethnicity, religion, gender, age, disability, and geographic location. I will just mention one sort of anecdotal after a while that will say how it is inclusive. Along with designing local level adaptation program, it creates space for voluntary migration to be used as one of the adaptation tool for climate change and disaster induced people. It plans for safe and sustainable cities inclusive to new migrants, encourages involvement of private sector. Now, we have seen that plans are made, national strategies are made, but they are hardly implemented. So once that national strategy was developed, straight away, the Ministry of Disaster and Relief came up with a plan how to materialize this, so to develop an action plan. And that action plan, covers 2022 to 2042. Over the next 20 years, the government of Bangladesh wants to implement this particular national strategy through this action plan. And if you want to look at the action plan, the link is here. Also, the national strategy link is here. And it is just before the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Meeting in August 2022, the government has adopted the national strategy and the action plan as well. Now, what is innovative about this strategy and action plan? Both are successful in breaking the silos, ensured multi-sectoral, multi-layered participation, materialize an innovative technique of combining the voices of displaced and the policymakers by using photo-voice technique of research. Now, if you see that there are interministerial consultations, there are consultations with UN bodies like DDWG network, then there is this committee, working committee, which actually prepared the document, and then there is this international advisory body from whose knowledge we have learned. I can see Matthew is sitting here, he's there, and others from IDMC, UNDRR, they all provided their input into this document. So, what is most important is the voice of the displaced. Look at them. These are the people who got displaced, and we provided them with a camera, and also the policymakers, we provided them with a camera. And we actually had workshops with them and say, what are the challenges that you want to meet through displacement management activities? And policymakers came up with their photos, and then displaced people came up with their challenges in photos. And then we sat with them, talked with them, and whatever they were saying, we were writing, putting them into words, and took certain pictures and then presented together, first separately with policymakers, then with the displaced population, then together as a national consultation, and then we could see both could appreciate both's problem, and then there is a synergy developed, and that is reflected in the national strategy. So what are the conclusions? The conclusion is the global community can learn from the people of Bangladesh how to transform vulnerabilities into opportunities. The other vulnerable countries can follow the template and prepare their own national strategies on displacement. Already there is an attempt from Bangladesh government, who was the last chair, for the 55 vulnerable countries to provide this template so that they develop their own national strategy on this. Many development partners are designing their future programs with major emphasis on climate change adaptation. They can invest on those components of the strategy and action plan which match their interest of work in Bangladesh. Lastly, as part of the climate justice, GOB also requires global cooperation, concessional access to green fund, climate bridge funds, and technology transfer. I'll just give you one anecdotal that I have said in the beginning. I'll say it is a success story of this mechanism. Not only a national strategy is being made and action plan. It is when we were doing this photo voice in Chattogram city, that's where the mayor came. Mayor was part of this process, city mayor, and then those displaced population. And when he saw in the final workshop, when he saw that what is the problem of ethnic community is that they cannot have a place of congregation in urban locations because they came from hill areas, but Muslim population, they don't have that problem. There are mosques everywhere. But for them, congregation place is their social, cultural space. And mayor straight away provided space for them. So this is a straight away success at that point of time of making their voice heard and actions taken. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview of the innovative strategy and action plan adopted by the government of Bangladesh, highlighting the consistent integration of international human rights standards and guidelines informed by decades of practice elsewhere, the particular emphasis on the participation of affected people, highlighting not only in principle why that's important, but how it can actually make a difference in particular contexts. That's really, really encouraging and inspiring to see. So thank you so much for that. But a final point there is the call for international finance because of the resource implications of dealing with this massive scale of displacement. It can't all be on the countries that are on the front lines. Another country that is on the front lines is Vanuatu, and we have here Eslene Garibiti, and we have a slightly different format for this last part of the session. So I will be asking a few questions to Ms. Garibiti, and we'll hear a bit about the Vanuatu policy on internal displacement. So to start us off, we need the mic to work. It sounds like it's working. And so I'll pose the first question, which is basically asking you to introduce Vanuatu's policy on climate-related internal displacement and tell us a bit about what led the country to adopt such a policy.
Thank you. For Vanuatu, the government of Vanuatu is committed to uphold the rights of its citizens, not only in normal times, but also in times of disasters. So our aim is to ensure that during the times of displacement, people that are displaced maintain their rights to life and with dignity, protection and security. So it happened with the tropical cyclone Pam. When the cyclone hits and people have to be displaced, and that was the time that we found out that it is very difficult to provide effective support and assistance to meet the needs of those people who have been displaced. So there was also increasing examples of displacement in Vanuatu at the moment due to other disasters, but also due to increasing rise of the sea level and increasing threat of climate impacts. So some displaced people also even moved to informal settlement, but that also caused other problem because informal settlement, they cause other issues with land tenure or other issues where the government has to provide assistance to where they have been displaced. So we have to develop the policy. The government action is to consider consistency and strategy in seeking to consider causes and consequences in terms of displacement in Vanuatu. So the development of that policy was deliberate to consider not only the slow onset, but also the fast onset of disasters, because these are all the types of disasters that we face in Vanuatu. So we were also conscious to ensure that the policy is applicable to, as I said earlier, to all types of disasters. And also Vanuatu is rich in culture and customs and tradition. So we also ensure that traditional knowledge is maintained. And in that way, displacement is also causing impacts some may say it's negative, but some may say it's positive to an environment where they're displaced. In some situation, there is an exchange of culture in the area where the people are displaced, even though they can cause some burdens to the government. So that was the reason and the issue around that policy.
And now the policy has been around for some years. I think it was adopted in 2018. We've heard from Professor Siddiqui about the action plan and the importance of implementation. How are things looking in Vanuatu in terms of making the policy translate into practice?
I think it's the same problem with other places where funding is on limitation. We have the policy, but we need financial assistance to be able to effectively implement the policy. The NDMO have taken some of the elements of the policy to look at how they can relate to disaster. Because as I said, the policy also consider displacement in terms of climate change, not only in terms of disaster. So the NDMO consider the area of the areas that are considering the displacement due to disasters. So there were some achievement with that policy. With the coordination of national disaster response, there is an establishment of a displacement cluster that is looking at all issues that are related to displacement in times of declared disaster. Even in the provincial areas, there are some community disaster committees that have been established. In Panoto, we have so far established 200 community disaster committees. And there are also training that have been provided at the level of community to ensure that there is understanding in times of displacement, to consider the rights of people when they are displaced, but people have to be aware and be educated on that. So there are some training that have been happening in the communities, and there are some guidelines as well that have been developed. So far there are some of those things that have been developed after the policy has been developed. Sorry.
You mentioned the financial aspect that makes it challenging to implement. Of course, one of the characteristics of Vanuatu is also that the population is spread over a vast area with multiple islands, and that must create challenges of a distinctive type. How do you deal with that?
Yes, the island setting is having 80 islands, all spread from north to south. But the government has established structures in community. So we have in all areas, we have area administrators, and we have area secretaries that are responsible to, they are like the representative of the government down at the community level. So they are looking after all issues that are related to displacement, not only in displacement, but other issues that are affecting the community. So it is a structure that is well established through the government and by the government, and they are working across all sectors. They are supporting across all sectors, not only in times of disasters, but they are also working with the education portfolio, and also with other NGOs. They are facilitating some works of the NGOs. So despite the remoteness of the islands, I think the structure is working very well. We can see positive impact during the tropical cyclone Harold response recently in Vanuatu. The response have happened very effectively because of those established structures that supported the works that we do in terms of disaster risk reduction activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. what we're hearing from both you and Professor Siddiqui is the relevance of legal and policy frameworks, capacity strengthening, and different other points that we've touched upon today. We have time against us, but we do have an opportunity to invite members of the audience here or online to pose questions. Please, I invite you, if anyone does have questions, to keep them to the point, and then we will have an opportunity for some brief responses from the panelists. We're limited to about 10 minutes here, so I can take a couple. I saw hands. Here's one, and we'll have two and maybe a third. That's all we can manage, I think.
Thank you very much. My name is Gopal Shivakuti. I'm from Nepal. I represent a human rights organization based in Nepal, as well as Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. What a galaxy of luminaries and all 4 female speakers, this afternoon. And I know most of them, 80% of them. I've worked very closely with them. So it's been quite a thought-provoking kind of session. My observation here is that I'm just taking one example of my own country, Nepal, where we have an IDP, comprehensive IDP policy, which was adopted back in 2007 and endorsed by the Council of Ministers. But we're waiting until now to adopt directives to operationalize the IDP policy. So the directives, the draft directives that we have already prepared, also with assistance from the Norwegian Refugee Council and other friends abroad. And there has been human rights as a principal cardinal component of the directives or draft directives, which is yet to be adopted by the government. And we have referred the UNDRR, the Words into Action document under Sendai framework, Objective E. And for that reason, we've also translated the entire document into Nepali language and distributed to all the stakeholders, and organized series of events with the governments, agencies, and everyone. It's well received by everyone, but there are some hurdles. Like in Nepal and other countries in the regions, there are some impediments. There are some hurdles that the government is not moving forward to translate the principle into action. So my specific question here is, among these luminaries and human rights champions, that how the civil society organizations can really persuade the concerned government agency with any examples from the regions so that the rights of the displaced persons can be effectively addressed, and a proper framework, it could be a legal framework or a policy framework or directive framework, can be adopted so that things will move in a very smoother manner towards the protection of those destitute without destination. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take the other questions and then we'll answer. Please, other questions, limit yourself to 1 minute.
That's not fair. Definitely gender discriminatory. Thank you, but thank you for the opportunity. A pleasure listening to all of you. Cecilia, you mentioned all other UN conventions as part of the human rights framework. What about CEDAW, which is the one and only charter of rights for women and gender? So I just wanted to add that. Well, I mean, there are others, but I think that stands out. CEDAW stands out. And you referred to the Constitution, and obviously we have seen many countries which say in the Constitution equal rights, but it doesn't happen. Here, my question is that you are the special rapporteur for internally displaced persons, and the proposal that you have put forward makes me think of when the internally displaced people move and there are informal settlements, they're often removed from there through force. And even that I come from Bangladesh and we have a national strategy, we have our action plan, it's the state, the government, the poor people versus the corporate. What kind of mechanism can be adapted within the human rights mechanism to ensure that the corporate interest does not take over the human rights component? And how can we get national governments to report on these framework or policies as a part of the national reporting, whether it's determined contributions? And my last point is, we've just had the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Climate Justice come to Bangladesh, and he's with Ian Fry, and he said, so how will these different special rapporteurs will work and coordinate and take the issue of human rights loss and damage forward?
Thank you. Now, 10 minutes remaining, and we've only got 4 panelists to respond. I think we need to give the floor to them. I know other people wanted to ask questions, but it won't be just to the panelists forcing them to rush through these answers. So let's give the floor in order, and we can give it to Christelle first, and invite you to answer questions about civil society's role. Maybe that question about Special Rapporteur could be for Cecilia.
Yes, I will not try to answer that one. Thank you, Matthew. I'll be brief because I think our other panelists will have more to say than I. But when it comes to the participation of civil society, of course, there are many ways that civil society organizations can contribute and make a difference. And also, I don't really like to use the word advocate in this context, but just really make the case for increased investments, more inclusive support, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are those organizations, and I'm sure there are some of you in the room who are part of them, who contribute directly to providing assistance and to supporting displaced people in disaster contexts, and also to helping them exert their rights. There are also others who are investing in advocacy and really elevating those messages to the highest possible levels in the general public and politically. We've taken the approach of using data and stronger evidence to strengthen the argument that it's actually a business case and a good return on investment, if I may say, in a very crude way, to invest in prevention and better responses, because the longer term consequences, of course, on people, but also on the economy, if that is what speaks most to some, can be really devastating. That's also why we had subtitled our report that we just launched and that I mentioned, a business case for prevention. Because given the scale of the phenomenon, I'll repeat, 225 million displacements over the past decade or so across the region, and all of the costs and financial losses associated with each of them, we really try to demonstrate in this report that it's more cost-effective to try and prevent the phenomenon and to try and include as many people as we can in durable solutions. So that's another way that civil society, like we, can try to contribute to solutions and to the debate. But yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have one day for a seminar on the use of UN human rights mechanisms? Joking aside, I think those questions are very important. Very briefly, with regard to Gopal's question, I think the role of civil society should not only be the role of civil society. It should be the role of civil society with the affected people, with the internally displaced. And I think that you can go much more there than just by acting. Not just as a voice, but with the people. On the UN mechanisms, I did mention equality of women as a very important aspect, and that's covered by CEDAW. But also, there were many questions actually. But I would like to go to that issue of evictions. And eviction, as is actually, forced eviction can actually be a human rights violation, as we all know, particularly when there is hardly any basis or the processual due process is also not followed. Okay, this is, again, law. And in fact, I have cooperated a lot with the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing in issuing particular communications looking at evictions of people that have resulted to internal displacement. After all, the guiding principles on internal displacement does say that one of the causes for internal displacement are violations of human rights. But when we have situations like this, it is not just the state who has to be is implicated, as you rightly said, but also the corporations. And I just want maybe also inform you that my upcoming report to the UN General Assembly is actually on development-induced displacement, which will include, among others, internal displacement caused through evictions. So it's already published on the OHCHR website. Very quickly on coordination among special rapporteurs, we coordinate a lot. In fact, we've got a coordination mechanism which is very, very active among the special rapporteurs. We also have an annual mechanism. We issue communications, which is not very well known to a lot of humanitarians, actually. Communications that are joint communications. As I said, I have issued a good number of communications to the SR and housing, also with other special rapporteurs or working groups, such as the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So we are 45 special rapporteurs, all in all. And when it comes to a specific issue where we would be implicated, like the right to health, the right to food, the right to rights of children, etc., we do come together on, in terms of talking to each other and decide how to go about it. And last but not the least is that even though each special rapporteur or working group would have his or her own or their own, when it comes to working groups, vision of how the specific mandate is going to be implemented, we are all agreed that when it comes to indivisibility of human rights, we do have to work together. I have been very privileged as the rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons to have been joined many times by other colleagues from the special rapporteur system. Precisely when you talk about the human rights of IDPs, you have all those other human rights that are implicated. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tasneem and then Eslene.
Okay, we only have 3 minutes,
yeah.
So I'll be very quick. Our colleague from Nepal, actually, the question he raised about civil society's role, I would say that that's very important, but civil society and the way you said, those who are displaced, if they work together, then you come up with a national strategy. If you look into this is a national document that I have presented. It is not donor-driven. It is very much, so civil society is part of the national process, and government is taking it, buying it, and how to implement the way we designed this strategy. Many of the government programs are already incorporated in this strategy. So when it comes to the question of housing, the housing for displaced population, what Bangladesh government is making, we are bringing in the sphere standard in that. So that way, these are already being implemented, and these will be reported in when this ministry is reporting. So in everywhere, we try to make it whatever government program is. So link with that and bring in standard to that particular component. So time-wise, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
The floor is yours, Eslene.
As
Civil society's role.
As I'm into the examples, the real examples on the ground, for Vanuatu, we work closely with civil society. It's the government that coordinates and set the direction, and all follows. So there's no issue with us. We work well together. Thank you.
Thank you. On that point, because in many countries, people from other countries might think, is that really possible? RWI was in Vanuatu in 2019 and had fantastic consultations with civil society and the government, and we heard the same from civil society, that they actually do work incredibly well together, and we found that inspiring. We're coming to the end with just a minute left of the session, a human rights-based approach to disaster displacement. If there's takeaways for you, the first one is, of course, that displacement is a human rights issue. And that raises a lot of questions, and Cecilia was hoping we'd have a day to discuss it, and we don't. But it's got different dimensions, and some of those are challenging and relate to deep structures of discrimination and resource access and land issues, and these things might seem intractable. But at the same time, and this is a lot of the work that the Raoul Wallenberg Institute is doing, we can translate some of these international standards and guidelines into practical tools for operational actors. And that's something a little bit like what we heard from Professor Siddiqui in terms of making the sphere standards work in a disaster displacement context, systematically integrating these principles across national and subnational law, policy, practice, capacity strengthening, etc. This is a massive issue for the region. We can't leave it to the states alone. We can't leave it to civil society alone. There's clearly a role for international actors, finance in particular, but the conversation doesn't stop here, even though the red light is telling me to bring it to a close. Next session in 30 minutes. Thank you so much.